other side of Australia. There he is.
We will see.
It's glorious. How's that, Dan? It's all over you.
Great, great. Well, I heard the kind words you were saying before, mate, and I have to say, it's gone straight to my head because from what I'm understanding, I am a massive head on a screen where you guys are right now. So glad to be the Wizard of Oz practicing and beaming in to Perth tonight. I'm glad you guys can kind of join in for this. This has been second of kind of two opportunities to share on a couple of bigger questions that people keep asking. And so this one tonight, I wanted to explore this question that hopefully is coming up on your screen from afar. And it's exploring the question that I get asked a lot, which is, life is pretty good where I am. So I'm wondering, why do I need God if I'm happy without him? And this is a question we'll find littered around Australia, particularly given that we live in the land of the happy pagan, where life is so good. And so what I want to do tonight, whether this is a question that you've had yourself or you're having conversations with friends or family who raise this, I want to be able to explore it for you and a number of different ways that I like to respond to this question in conversation so that it might be useful when those conversations do come up. But I want to kick off by asking the question as to whether right now you would consider yourself a happy person. Because happiness isn't one of those things that's necessarily all that easy to define. It often varies from person to person and place to place. But since I am an Oxford guy, I thought I'd go straight to the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines happiness as the following: the state of being happy. That's not exactly enlightening, is it? Kind of a circular definition. And so I decided to go then to the Oxford definition for happy. And this is what it says. It says, happiness is a state, not a trait. In other words, it isn't a long-lasting permanent feature, but a more fleeting, changeable state. It says feeling or showing pleasure or contentment. And so as psychologists reflect on what it means to be happy or to experience happiness, this is what they say. It's a state of being, not a personality trait. It's momentary, circumstantial, not something that's long lasting. It's fleeting. It's not permanent. Now, you might not realize that research into happiness has become big business over the years. Governments all over the world are now using measures for well-being and happiness in terms of their policy decision-making. Just across the pond from us, New Zealand, have decided that any budgetary spending during the current government has to fulfill one of the 5 major markers for well-being that they have identified. And if you can't justify that it increases happiness overall, well, then it's not something that the government is willing to spend more money on. And research into what makes people happy has really taken off since the dawn of the 21st century. It's become an entirely new field within sort of social studies and psychology. And by means of various controlled studies, we now know quite a lot about people's experience of happiness. From a huge study that was done, 1.3 million people over 51 countries, the so-called U-curve of happiness, as you'll be seeing it on your screen right now, was identified. And long story short, if you are in your late teenage years or early 20s, you are as happy as you will ever likely be. That's where happiness peaks. And from there, it starts diving down in your mid to late 20s. It bottoms out around your 40s to 50s when life is just super, super tough before becoming relatively good again, leading into retirement years and then tapering off as your health tapers off. So I don't know whether that encourages you wherever you are at life, hoping happiness is just around the corner, but according to statistics, you may be in for a little bit of a headache for quite some time. The World Happiness Report, though, which is released every couple of years since its inception back in 2012, ranks different countries based upon their levels of happiness. In the most recent surveys just from last year, Australia just fell out of the top 10. We're coming in as the 11th happiest country. If you're wondering what the happiest place on earth is, that is not Disneyland. It turns out it's Finland, but close. But this is more of the individual statistics that we get coming out of the McCrindle Research Forum here in Australia. And what they wanted to do is explore how do Aussies relate to their own experience of happiness. And what they found is that 13% of Aussies said that they're very happy, 31% that they are significantly happy, and 33% said that they're moderately happy, meaning that's quite a chunk of Australians that would at least identify identify somewhere on the happier side of life, with only 15% saying only slightly happy and 9%, well, you know, the kind of people that fit into that category, the chronically unhappy kind. So us Aussies are a relatively happy people. And when you think about it, what's not to love? We have this sun-kissed nation that's full of cuddly creatures and white sandy beaches. It sounds like the recipe for happiness. But what's interesting, though, is how in Australia in particular, as well as many other Western nations where happiness is doing quite well, it's also led to something of an ambivalence towards the God question, a numbness towards spiritual things, where people wonder, what place is there for God in my life? Surely if God was so relevant to everyday life, so indispensable to being happy, then I wouldn't feel this way. But I am a relatively happy pagan. Many of my friends would tell me I can be good without God. And so, Christian, the question is over to you. If God is so good, why am I happy without him? Now, what I want to do in just the next 20 minutes before we have Q&A together is explore 4 different responses that are really wrapped up in wrong assumptions that people have when it comes to God. And the first misunderstanding or wrong assumption that I want to pick up on is, if you are a happy person and you don't believe in God, then why don't you credit God and give him thanks? Now, let me pause out what I mean by this. There are a ton of people who are under the impression that belief in God, or in Christianity in particular, it's really just a kind of crutch to get through life. It's a psychological crutch for the needy who just can't really cope with reality, and that you only run to God when you have a problem, that he's big sky daddy up there looking out for you. And if anything goes wrong, that's when you dial the red phone all the way up, not to the president, but to the big man upstairs. And so if then your life is good, you don't need God. But the truth of Christianity and a relationship with God extends far beyond just some kind of psychological need. You see, whether or not God exists has nothing to do with your or my desires. Like my own physical body or like a banana, God either does exist or he doesn't. And so it depends on the evidence as to whether or not we should believe in God and therefore act accordingly. Just because you don't want God to exist doesn't mean that he doesn't. But if God does exist according to the available evidence, and the Bible describes him as a heavenly father to us as his earthly kids, then I think we have a good reason to be able to explain why, even if you don't believe in him, you can still experience all kinds of happiness in this life. And the reason is that he set up the system that way. I mean, think about what makes life happy, the circumstances around us, whether it's delicious food that we enjoy, whether it's love, whether it's justice, whether it's pleasure or satisfaction or adventure. All of these are features that God built into the system. They're his gifts to us as his human creatures. And he designed the world to function in such a way that if you go with the moral grain of God's universe, then it tends to generally go well for you. If you don't punch people in the face, they tend to like you. If you work hard, it tends to result in some kind of meaningful output to support yourself and enjoy this world. And as such, this is the message of Proverbs, that if you do good, good ultimately will result. Even if you don't believe in God, you can still tap into that kind of fabric. And so that means that you can experience happiness without believing in God, but precisely because God gives rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. He doesn't just show favoritism to Christians, that everyone else sucks life and Christians have an awesome life. No, good things are built into the system. And whether or not you're a Christian, you can still experience them. And many of these good things are really difficult to explain purely on what we might call a secular or atheistic register. And so what I would say to someone who says, I'm happy, why do I need God? I would say, well, if you are happy, then if God exists, the only right response is to give thanks to God. You can imagine what we would say of a kid who grew up needing his parents, relying on their love and their financial support, who when he turns 18 and gets a job, pretends like he doesn't have parents just because he doesn't need them for his own sustenance anymore.
that wouldn't reflect well on the character of that child. And he's missing out on the idea of what is on offer with a relationship with his parents as a source of identity and meaning and wisdom and joy. And so what I would want to say is, maybe if you're enjoying life, maybe if you're happy, that should prompt you to give thanks to God, which is precisely what Romans 1 tells us that we should do towards our Creator. The second way I would want to respond to a question like this is to raise whether or not happiness is really a secure foundation upon which to build your life. I mean, honestly, if someone said, hey, I'm happy, why do I need God? I would say, I'm glad you're happy. Really, I am. But the happiness that you're experiencing right now, based upon your momentary circumstances that surround you, is something that can be stolen away in a moment. As those positive psychologists tell us, it is a fleeting state, subject to change. And this is the entire theme of the book of Ecclesiastes, which is something of a companion to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament wisdom literature. Now, because even if you go with the moral grain of God's universe, thinking proverbially that that's going to work out well for you, what Ecclesiastes want to tell us is that there's actually more to the picture. It's more complex than that. And if you've never read Ecclesiastes for yourself, it's super easy to get confused in this book because there are actually two voices speaking. It might be helpful to think of it more like an interviewer and an interviewee. And the author of the book, the interviewer, he wants to help you reflect on the teacher or the interviewee's observations about life, but not so that you'll agree with his final conclusion, but that you'll come to recognize that your life needs something more than what this teacher has to offer. You need a deeper meaning to your life. Because the whole goal of Ecclesiastes is to kind of operate like a flashbang with percussive effect to get you to reconsider life's true purpose. And to do that, the author kind of topsy-turvies your entire life. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer. The next couple of minutes can be really a bit of a downer, not unlike the U-curve of happiness. Hint, you don't read Ecclesiastes for some kind of pithy encouragement. Because what the teacher picks up on are these three things that he's observed about the way that the world ultimately works. Number one, he speaks about the march of time when he says that generations come and generations go, but the earth has been here long before and it will be long after. People come and go, but they too will be forgotten simply in a couple of generations. You see, his point is that on a cosmic scale, you and me, we're just a blip on the radar of history, that we're not going to be remembered 100 years from now. The second grim observation that he makes is the idea that everyone ultimately is going to die. In Ecclesiastes 3:19, he says that humans face the same fate as the animals, death. All people, the righteous and the wicked, they all share this same destiny. All this activity, madness, and then we join the dead. It's kind of a dull picture when you consider your life through the eyes of the fact that every single one of us one day are going to end up in the grand death toll of humanity, like the coronavirus stats that continue to roll on. And the third thing that he observes to really just make you feel terrible is life's random nature. He says in Ecclesiastes 9:11 that I have seen something else under the sun, that the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. And he's trying to give a bit of a chink in the armor when it comes to Proverbs, that it doesn't always work out cause and effect according to the wisdom that we see. So everything that we experience in this life, it's going to be eroded by the sands of time. We are all destined for death. And even if you do well, like the Tony Robbinses of this world, at mastering the wisdom of the system, there is no guarantee that doing the right thing is going to lead to the outcomes that you want. Like some of my dear friends, young of age, you could be diagnosed with cancer, or you could be struck down with depression or a debilitating sickness, or you could get a divorce or die in a car accident. There simply are no guarantees. Now, that's the kind of bleak meta-analysis of life that you and I spend so much of our time ignoring, but that's been thrown up in our face, even just over the pandemic these past few months. And so what then is the interviewee, the teacher's conclusion? Well, he said, if this is all that we have here under the sun in this life, well, then he kind of joins in the voice of pop culture where he says, YOLO, you only live once. So eat, drink, be merry, because tomorrow you die. And he talks about, though, trying to find meaning and satisfaction in the various avenues of this world, eating, drinking, and being happy. He's tried wealth. He amassed huge amounts of gold and goods. He's tried wisdom to become a sage in the minds of others. He's tried esteem, being thought of well by those around him. He's tried women, indiscriminately pursuing relationships and sex and marriage and romance. And he's tried work by doing huge projects that he can look back on and be proud of. And yet, having done all of this in his lifetime, how does he reflect on his experience? Well, nearly 40 times across the book of Ecclesiastes, he picks up on this Hebrew word Hevel, which is translated meaninglessness in most of our English Bibles. It's a word, though, in Hebrew that denotes a smoke or a vapor. It's something of an enigma. It's something that when you look at it in the distance, it looks solid, but when you go up to try and take hold of it, it really just slips through your fingers. And he said that is what life is like here under the sun. Now, if you were to look into the literature around philosophy of life and philosophy of meaning, you'll find that there are really two kinds of purpose and meaning that they talk about in this life. And philosophers call these created meanings, the ones that we try to make up on our own: wealth and women and wisdom and work, the things that our hearts cling on to as meaning makers for us. And they say that these created meanings are thin or fragile. I'll say that this is so because they can be, like we said, stolen away in a moment. They can be disrupted by the difficulties of life. And yet, here's the thing that the book of Ecclesiastes is ultimately kind of pointing us towards: that the goal of Christianity, even of a relationship with God, it's not primarily happiness in our circumstances here and now, it's holiness. The goal of being a Christian, of having a relationship with God, is to become like Jesus so that we're made ready to enjoy God's presence for all eternity. And because life here is about becoming the right kind of person in relationship to God, it actually doesn't matter what your external circumstances are, what happens to us on the outside. Even the worst experiences in God's hands can be used like a forge to help us become the kind of person that God made us to be. And so if you become a Christian, the purpose of your life to know and glorify God, and the meaning of your life to follow God's purposes and plans for you, that's something that cannot be stolen from us. It's not thin or fragile. This discovered meaning that the philosophers speak of is thick. It is resilient. It's something that can ultimately endure the realities that Ecclesiastes paints. And so Ecclesiastes ends with the interviewer, the author of the book, saying, because of what the teacher learned by living life wrong, try and live life right. Focus not on what is below the sun or under the sun, but what is above the sun. Fear God, live for God, live with God, live in light of eternity. And it seems to me that a relationship with God is just a more sure foundation for your life that cannot be stolen from you. And where, for better or worse in your circumstances, you can still experiencing the joy of God's presence, knowing that ultimately he's forming his final world in you, getting you ready for that. And here's the thing that I find almost a strange irony in this: that if that's what you do in this life, cling to your relationship with God or pursue God as the source of your meaning, then on average, you actually end up happier. In one of the biggest research projects that's been done over the past 20 years, looking into the relationship between happiness and religious belief, particularly intrinsic religious belief or belief that shapes the way that you live, what they discovered is that 47% of religious people said that they were very happy, compared to just 28% of their secular neighbors. In other words, people with God are just happier. And I think this is what C.S. Lewis was aiming at when he hinted in Mere Christianity, that if you aim at heaven, you will get earth thrown in. But if you aim at earth, you will get neither. That leads me to the third thing that we should all respond with, I think, when someone says, I'm happy without God. So what's up with that? And this is where things get serious, because it begins to talk about The idea that if we do not respond to Jesus right now, all of us are just dead people walking. Now, the photo that's on your screen is of the casket of my wife's grandfather, who we laid in the ground just a number of years ago. Like what Ecclesiastes said, there are some truths here that we need to grapple with as death approaches. Now, Jesus diagnosed every single one of us as having a terminal disease, and he calls it sin, that the wages of sin is death. And this isn't really comfortable for any of us to hear, but it helps no one to pretend otherwise. And the Christian story describes how humans, having been created for God's good presence and having conditional immortality, having access to the tree of life, we rebelled against God. We walked against God's moral grain, and so doing became damaged by evil and therefore susceptible to the same disease and death and decay that lay outside Eden's borders. And what this means is that even if we feel great right now, every single one of us is ultimately going to die. And without Jesus, that death is eternal. We will be separated from God, from his life and light and love for all eternity. You see, when Jesus came as the great physician, that was his diagnosis. And if you went to the doctor right now, still feeling great, experiencing no symptoms, but he said, hey, I know you feel great, but you have a terminal disease. There is only one cure. You would be a fool not to take his recommendation seriously. And the truth is, Jesus came to put YOLO to death, to replace it with Yale, where you actually live eternally. Because if Jesus did die in our place and then supernaturally rise from the dead, then that is precisely what he offers you and me. He offers us eternal life. And according to Jesus, every single one of us is ultimately going to face giving a final account to God. And there we cannot barter trying to overcome our sinful deeds with our righteous ones. Only Jesus can save us. And so that's why the gospel is good news, that you can be happy with God for all eternity, not because of what you've done, but because of what Jesus has ultimately done. So why God if I'm happy? Well, I would say you should give thanks to God, even if you don't recognize your deep need for him, because he set the system up this way so that you could enjoy it. I would say that perhaps you shouldn't bank on happiness, which can be stolen away, but instead bank on the meaning and purpose that comes through a relationship with God. And you should cling to the gospel, to Jesus, because he is the only way that you and I can escape the approaching terminus of death that is coming for each of us. But I want to finish with this, just a final fourth reason before we hit the Q&A. And it's the idea that true and lasting happiness is only found with God. Now, I spoke before about religious people being happier. And what I think they're tapping into, though, is a deeper vein of why. And it's that you and I were created for religious experience. We were created for a relationship with God. If, as an anthropologist, you were to study human cultures back through history, there is a universal impulse in humanity to reach out for something beyond ourselves, to recognize that there's something invisible behind what we experience as the visible matter and energy of this universe. And this is what accounts for the multiplicity of religious beliefs around the world, some deep, unmet desire in the human heart. And C.S. Lewis said this is something that points to God. And the reason he did that, he said, well, if the universal hunger in the human stomach points to the reality of food, or if the universal thirst in human experience points towards the reality of a drink to which to satiate that thirst, and if the universal sexual desire in men and women points towards the reality of sex to be able to satisfy that hunger, then what do we say of the universal spiritual hunger that pops up in the human heart, the thing that we try and fill with everything else? Well, he would say that if we find within ourselves a desire which nothing in this physical world can satisfy, perhaps that is evidence, proof that we were made for another world. What I love about Jesus is that when it comes to a pursuit of desire, pursuit of happiness, he doesn't belittle desire in human experience. In fact, he simply seeks to say that we want to magnify it. It's not that we desire too much, but that we desire too little. And when Jesus spoke about his own nature, who he was, he said that when it comes to the deep hungers of the human soul, I am the bread of life. When it comes to the deep thirst of the human soul, I am living water that bubbles up into eternal life. And so I would want to say to someone who says, look, I'm happy, I would say, dig deeper. Consider what you're seeking to fill your desires with. What about those quiet moments in the dark of the night when Netflix is turned off and there's no entertainment, your ability to be with yourself alone? What are the hungers that grow up in you? And are they really met in reality? Because Jesus said that we have a deeper hunger within us that can be awakened. And that if we want to live life to the full, then that's precisely what he came to give to us. I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. So there's 4 different ways I would encourage you to respond to someone who says they're happy without God. But I think I'm going to give you a minute now just to maybe pause, chat to the person next to you and explore maybe what stood out from that. And also what questions would you love to ask in the Q&A? And then in 60 seconds, I'll call you back in and we can jump to a Q&A. I'll let Dan somehow figure out how to ask questions to me. So take a minute and chat amongst yourselves.
Who's George?
That's Georgia. Oh. Really? Yeah,
We're going to put it on the screen.
Negative? No, because we pinned him. You can still hear me?
Yeah, I think so. You can still hear us, don't you?
You can still hear me, yeah?
I can. I feel like we just stepped into someone's bedroom.
Everyone heard that.
It's great. So, we'll get them just to call it out to us.
All right, 15 more seconds, peeps.
So, tell me, you want to give a lady question to it, or you want me to come over?
You can do that. I mean, as much as I like talking to Dan, I don't like responsibilities.
All right, let's get it on.
Let's get it on.
All right, you guys ready? So the way it works, so you don't have a microphone connected to the laptop, is you have a question, you call it out to me, and then I run over to the laptop and I whisper in his ear.
Well, I can hear, Dan, I can hear you, if
Oh,
that
you
helps.
can hear me? I mean, I can still whisper in your ear. That's.
I'm nervous about you whispering anything in my ear.
No, so you can just call out one, and then I'll speak it out. And obviously, he can hear through the microphone. So anybody? Or do you have a structure you wanted to do, Dan? Anybody? Anyway. Be brave. Break the ice. Somebody break the ice.
I usually jump straight to the second question because no one likes asking the first question.
What's the second question? Oh, was it? Okay, well, the second question. Who would have a second question then? Anybody, come on. Be brave. I'm hoping that brains were working. Culture. Yes!
If you had 15 seconds to ask the question, how would you do it?
Do you hear that, Dan? So if you would, that's a difficult one. If you only had like, can we give him a minute? If you only had like 30 seconds to a minute to answer that question, how would you try to compress it down? What would be the most important parts that you would compress down into like a 30-second or 1 minute answer?
Great. I would say that this life is full of gifts from God to everyone, whether you believe in him or not, but those gifts can be taken away in a second as people experience. And so the only thing that lasts, the only thing worth basing your life on is something which can carry you into eternity.
Cool. I just got to say, I feel good. Anybody else? You worked the ice. Well done, my friend. Well done. But now, oh yes.
Do you think people can go their whole life without feeling that?
So the question was, do you think people can go their whole lives without feeling that need, that emptiness is what you're talking about within them?
I mean, this is a great question. It's impossible for me to answer that because I don't know people's hearts. I know my own heart at different points when I was a Christian, but before I was as well. And there are always times when getting exactly what I want or what my heart desires in that moment, you kind of experience and you're like, oh, is that it? And that's something I've heard again and again and again from secular people, from religious people who receive or get to the height of what they thought would ultimately fulfill them. And they're like, but I'm not all that fulfilled. I'm still me. I'm still relatively unchanged. And so I think what the Bible seems to say is that God puts eternity in the hearts of people. I think there is a deep hunger that people have. I just don't think we know how to talk about it. And so if you've grown up thinking that God doesn't exist, then you'll just put that down to a search. I'm searching for what's going to fill me. But I definitely think that that's a hunger that God's put there, that Jesus is trying to say, look, this is something that I'm meant to fulfill. This God-shaped hole is something that I'm meant to fill. Those deep soul hungers and thirsts is something that I'm meant to fulfill. And so drink deep, eat up. I don't think you'll ever get to a place though where people will universally recognize that. So, in the same way that Romans 1 says we should give thanks to God, it says we don't, that we neither glorified God nor gave thanks to him, but rather we exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than our creator who is to be forever praised. Amen. And so I think that's the pattern that we fall much more easily into, is there is this God hole, but we fill it with created things, those created meanings that I was talking about. And it takes a fair bit of self-reflection or even a willingness to be self-critical to pick up on the fact that maybe it's not working. I'm 33 and my life is full of beautiful things, a lovely wife, 3 great kids, a ton of things that, on the outside you would say, what else could I possibly want? And yet I still even know within my own heart that these things, as good as they are, as momentary as the happiness brings, I always have deeper hungers that are there for something beyond that. And so, I'm glad. I'm glad that I'm looking forward to a foundation and a country and a city whose builder and maker is God, that I'm not there yet.
I had a really interesting conversation with a girl that came to God, came to their life a long time, from back when I was actually pastor way back in Brisbane. And we're doing The Reason for God by Tim Keller in our connect group when we did the week on meeting. And I just asked her, I said, what do you think? Like, you're not a Christian, not a believer, so where is meaning for you? And I found his answer really, really fascinating, because essentially what she was saying is, actually there's an awareness that there's a real kind of emptiness there, but what do you do? Because if you don't know that there's something more, what do? You just make the best of what there is. So yeah, there's actually, that she would actually say that in her family and in her own life, she could identify, yeah, I wish there was something more, but I don't know anything more. So you just learn to accept and do the best with what you have, which kind of puts this wonderful thing back to us. Then would be that this challenge to us to then actually live as these people who are living in the fullness of life that Jesus has for us. I say one of the greatest things you could do to be a witness would to actually just genuinely love Jesus and be full of joy. Because if he doesn't mean everything to you and that hasn't completely changed your life, and Jesus isn't just at the center and he's not that red hot center, I'm just on fire for Jesus, what hope could you possibly share with anybody? Because it hasn't changed your life, or why would it change theirs? Like if Jesus doesn't mean everything, and he isn't this incredible source of joy and meaning in my life, then why would I try to shove him on you? Like, it's got to start here with us. And there's this incredible witness that happens when people actually just learn to more and more deeply walk with Jesus and learn to love and trust and know Jesus. And the deeper that we walk with Jesus, the more that we trust him, the more that he becomes that center, that source of joy and life, the more that the life that Jesus promises actually radiates out of us, and then we have good news to share with people. So there is a sense it's got to start here with us, and there's a part of why we're called to permeate all society, that people might actually see that, you know what, I don't know if there's more meaning out there. I kind of feel a little bit hopeless, but what else is there? And then they see and they go, that person seems to have something that I don't. So there's a challenge within us as well. Sorry, Dan, go.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that.
Okay.
Amen. That wasn't a question. That was an emphatic statement of goodness.
That's good. That's good. That would have been awkward otherwise. Anybody else? Please keep them coming. Yes.
I don't know if this is quite a question, but then does that almost lead to this question? So I think a lot of non-Christians that aren't happy go, well, the people that are happy or purport to be happy are just faking it. So you Christians must be faking it too. And then if we don't keep up this, it also has this pressure to show others that joy. And I know that joy comes from Christ. I know that there's no pressure in that sense, but there's almost a pressure to show that joy to others. Not really a question, but I'm trying to get at something here.
Yeah, no, you are getting to a question, and it's a really good one. And the reality is, I didn't do a great job of distinguishing it, because I'm not even sure that the Bible really does. I think it's more of a forced definitional difference, but the idea of happiness and joy, or the difference between the two. Because what I was really trying to say is the way that both the Oxford Dictionary and positive psychologists speak about happiness, it's a state. It's something that is arranged by our circumstances, and it makes you feel happy, you know, so you're smiling. Yeah, this is great. I'm at a wedding. Yay, I'm smiling, unless I'm really not happy to be single. So I think in a situation like that, if what we're saying when we're very happy is, my circumstances make me happy, then I would agree. I think there are a ton of people who are faking it. And I think church culture can perpetuate that, where people come along to church and everyone seems happy, but internally they're dying because they're disappointed with where life is, or they're experiencing pain, or the effects of sin, or you know, just real kinds of hurt. And there's no space for a negative expression of emotion in life. And I think Christians are meant to have the full register open to us, that you can be angry, and you can be happy, and you can be frustrated and disappointed. You can be bland, you know, but be able to be okay with your current state of emotional experience, whilst at the same time recognizing, yet there is still something that drives me. The very fact that this is not how things will always be, that this does not define my future, that this does not define even my identity or my value or anything. That kind of picture of joy is what I know I possess, that can be untouched by these things by virtue of my relationship with God. And I would want to say, even in my own life, there are all kinds of, you know, I spoke about the benefits before. That's without knowing a ton of the hard things as well that are constants in my life. And so you think, a lot of the time I don't feel happy in the external sense. A lot of the time I feel pressured, or it's tough, and I'm trying to hold on and be faithful to God. And so but yet there is like this deep quality of knowing God, and of knowing the truth of the faith, and of understanding what awaits if we run our race faithfully and get to the end, you know. And for me, that is something that I would want to be able to hold out to my secular friends. Yeah, life is tough. I get that, but there's something that's more solid that you can hold on to at the same time. Think of Jesus when he says, those who hear my words and put them into practice will be like a wise man who built his house upon the rock, so that when the storms do come, even though they beat against the house, it stands. Whereas those who do not put my words into practice, the shifting sands will not uphold against those storms. And so that would be more what I want to offer, that you can lament in this life knowing that one day that's going to give way to happiness in God's presence.
All right. Anybody else got another question? Keep them coming. Yes.
Just wondering about the different relationships between God. And he said they're happier. Is there like a different kind of survey between the different religions?
Right. So Dan, if you can do that.
I heard enough of it. Yeah. So, not to make you useless, Dan, I do love hearing your commentary on the questions as well. But so as is often difficult with research, it tends to favor certain kinds of countries, people that are willing to get involved in the survey data. The one that I was talking about, I've got the links in some notes that I can send on to Dan. The survey data was predominantly taken from Western countries that are heavily Christianized. So you can almost read Christianity into the data rather than all other kind of world religions. But I don't think you would necessarily see all that much of a difference, precisely because we are a people who are wired for purpose. If we can tap into what we think that purpose is, even if it's to escape suffering vis-a-vis Buddhism, or if it's to fulfill the will of God vis-a-vis Islam, if you feel like you're on purpose, then that has a dramatic effect on even your sense of well-being. And so I think you would still see a much higher rate from probably religious people than seculars. But there are a ton of other features of Christianity in particular, the sense of community that's involved with the doing good towards others, the virtues that it fosters that also play into the well-being idea. I would say that Christianity particularly helps you navigate the proverbial nature of life, that kind of wisdom thread or the moral fabric of the universe, so that it goes relatively well for you.
Sweet. Any others? Yes.
I guess building on that, like for me at work, one of my good friends, and we often talk about faith, we talk about God, but it's sort of obviously you have two different definitions of what God is. And so when you talk about happiness, and I can see we're quite similar in what we would see to be happy, like that. But how do you sort of navigate those conversations to be clear about there is actually a difference here? And yeah, and maybe to a further extent, how do you evangelize that?
Yeah, it's a great question, really good question. And so I mean, one of the things to say, what would you do if the things, or what are the things that make you happy? Question number one. Question number two, what would you do if all of those things were taken away from you? So let's consider someone who is in a small accident and becomes a paraplegic or a quadriplegic. If what made your life so great was the ability to go adventuring, and all of a sudden a huge element of that is taken away from you, what meaning would your life have, or do you think you could be happy? And so it's really just helping people process their own reactions to the many things that come. And that's an extreme example. You could even say, well, what would you do if you were diagnosed with cancer? Or what would you do if you got fired or she left you, or whatever it kind of is that their happiness is resting on? It's just helping them recognize the fragility of that. And people may say, I'm cool with that. That's just the way that things are. And that just says, what if it isn't? What if there is another way that things could be? And so you're really trying to tease out one of two things. Is it a question for them that they don't want God to exist? In which case you're trying to talk about the relevance of Christianity towards a meaningful, happy life. Or is it that they don't believe that God does exist, and therefore you're trying to say, well, let's actually explore, okay, if the Christianity thing is true, you can see all the relevance, yes, true happiness is relationship with God. Yes, eternal life is on offer to escape death. Yes, purpose and meaning are much more solidly founded in a relationship with God. Yes, you should give thanks to God, but you just don't think it's real. So you're not doing those things. Well, then let's talk on the truth side. So most of what we try and do in a conversation is never come with a full prepared plan. It's more diagnostic. Where are you? And then what's the next step? So I would say, what makes you happy? What would happen if that was kind of taken away from you? Would you be interested if you were missing out on something and there's something more solid and even more fulfilling in life? And those three sort of step questions can be a lead to, here's what I've experienced and uncovered, and I wonder if it's of interest to you.
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you say to Christians that are unhappy and teetering on the, falling off of that kind of?
Yeah. I think you're experiencing life as it is in the shadow of Genesis 3. I think it's really important that we live the full Christian story and recognize the full gamut of human experience in this world. Because the reality is some people get life way easier and their circumstances are better, and they're just given by the happenstance of their genetics and God's providence, a different chemical makeup in their brain, and perhaps they've stewarded that well. Whereas other people, from our perspective, seemingly randomly, just get
a really crap serving of life. And so whether it's an inability for their brain to even feel happy and have the right kind of chemical balance, so it's a physiological thing, or whether it's patterns of life or things that have happened to them that others have done, I just don't say be happy. What I would say is cling to Jesus. And whether that results in feelings of happiness is really not up to us. That's really something that's either a work of God's Spirit or the overflow of healthy decisions in life. But we have, again, no guarantees on that. So I think there are a lot of unhappy Christians who are desperately waiting to be in God's presence. And I think that's okay, so long as you allow that to drive a longing for God and foster that longing for God. And what you may find is that in doing so, you actually experience more of that now. The thing you want to try and avoid is a bitterness in a comparison between your circumstances and someone else's circumstances, which is really easy for us to fall into, that kind of comparison trap. But just recognizing, God, if your goal for me in this life is not happiness, but holiness, if I'm unhappy right now, how can I allow my circumstances to drive me to pursue holiness rather than expect happiness? Because that's not really promised this side of eternity.
I always kind of think of, Tim Keller talks about the suffering Savior a lot, and I think it's something that I really resonate with is in times of suffering and struggle, it is great hope to me to know that Jesus suffered and struggled, and that he's not some God that looks from a distance and has no idea what it is to suffer and what it is to struggle, but actually he chose suffering that I might one day not suffer, that I don't have to. And that's great hope to me, and that gives me the picture of the God who I would turn to in the midst of suffering and struggle as opposed to turn away from. Because he's not this cold, distant God who doesn't care. He's a God who cares deeply and who's willing to actually take that on board himself, that I might want to be free from it. And so that's this great reminder to me that this is the person I want to turn to in the midst of struggle and
Yeah.
suffering, my suffering Savior. Anybody else have another question? Yes.
I feel like resilience is a really big thing. It's a big word nowadays, and everyone, is talking about it. And like I talked to a friend, and he said, I don't feel like I need God because when difficulties, challenges happen in life, when I can get through it on my own, that makes me feel good, makes me feel more stronger, more resilient. It's kind of like, how is holiness different to resilience?
That's a great question. And I don't think there's necessarily, they're not opposing poles in that sense. I would say that God's desire is that we would become like Jesus. And I don't mean that as a throwaway. Let me explain exactly what I mean. In creating human creatures in his image, God wanted us to reflect him back to the rest of creation. And he wanted us to participate in bringing order from chaos and taking the raw materials of the world and cultivating a garden and cities and building architecture and caring for animals, subduing the earth and ruling over it. That's in the beginning of our book. And then at the end of our book, it presents the heavenly Jerusalem, the marriage between heaven and earth, God coming to dwell with humanity, and that human beings would rule and reign with Jesus, that is God's end game or our eternal future, which means when I say holiness, it's not just a moral kind of quality, it's more also of a personal, individual maturity. And me right now raising 3 young boys, my job as a parent is not to keep boys, it's to raise adults, right? It's to help them grow into independence, to be able to function wisely as actors in the world who do good and contribute something. And I do think that is God's ultimate goal for us. And so I would want to say a couple of things. There are certainly all kinds of hardships where God may even seem hidden from Christians intentionally, precisely because the way I hide from my kids a little bit when they want me to come and do a task for them and I pretend I'm not there, so that they have to do it on their own. God is helping us grow up to learn to do things of our own wisdom and capacities and decision making, and for our good, for His glory, and for that ultimate future. But I would also say that, to this person, there are some things that are going to come your way that can absolutely floor you. And so the idea that Christianity is a psychological crutch for the weak, yeah, at times it is. Like if you break a leg, sometimes you need a crutch to be able to get through. And I think God is there to the degree that we absolutely need him, but helps us rehabilitate to become healthy humans who also have resilience. And so I kind of understand the person's point. I think we should lean into it to some degree, but I don't think that means that God has no part to play either as a loving father in our lives or as a help to be able to support us or strengthen us through difficult times. If you have, let's say, you're in my situation and one of my kids were to contract cancer and die, like one of my friends happened just recently, man, just get through that on your own, build resilience. That's a pretty mean-spirited thing to say to a person that's going through that kind of grief and hurt and trauma, where they just need people, community, and love around them to help them through that period of time, other people to carry them. And for many Christians, they have this great capacity when Jesus says, all you who are weary, laden, and heavy burden, come and I will give you rest for your souls. I think that's good news as well. So I don't think it's an either or. It's a good question.
Anybody else?
Dan, you've silenced the room.
Going twice. Wasn't me, it was you. I did nothing. All right. Okay, that looks like that's all the questions. Can we please thank Dan for sharing his music?
It's been great, everyone. Thanks for giving me some time in a hearing.
We so appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom with us and just being a great encouragement to us. So, thank you very much.
I'll send over some PDF notes with links and stuff if people are interested.
Beautiful. That sounds great. Okay.
Cool.
All right, everybody say goodbye to Dan.
Bye.
Bye, Dan.
See you, everyone.